Okay, audio 5. We'll finish this up fast, I hope. Why on earth did Taiwan, which had a Leninist party in the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, ruling it just like a Leninist party ruled China, why on earth did it end up developing into a democracy enabled by the son of the dictator who was, in many respects, similar to Mao Zedong himself, good old Chiang Kai-shek? The Jimo, or as Stilwell called him, Peanut. Not that I mean to be disrespectful, I'm just being an objective historian. I say occasional disrespectful things about Chairman Mao. Have to be even-handed in these matters. Because after all, they both managed to torture and kill countless individuals. Maybe one tortured and killed more than the other, but they were both Olympic athletes in that department. Zheng Jingguo, however, was a bit different, pragmatically speaking. He was some American officials in the 70s when I was a student, and I spoke to some American officials in Taiwan during that time, described Zheng Jingguo as a thug. He indeed had been responsible for many nasty things, but one of his endearing aspects was that he wanted to move Taiwan forward, not only socially and economically, but also politically, especially as he became older. He became, in the 1980s especially, more and more moderate in his political views, in particular about the pragmatic advantages of pluralistic politics, that is, having an opposition. And one of the reasons was that he realized that the developing middle class, which included a lot of property owners, not only property owners in the cities, but property owners in the countryside, would put up with martial law and dictatorship only so long. Taiwan had an advantage in this realm because it is an island. Therefore, you don't need the huge military that you would otherwise need, particularly facing a nasty opponent like the Chinese Communists. You don't need this huge military to defend your borders, because invading a big island over a long stretch of ocean is not an easy thing to accomplish. These other things here, which these ideas come mostly from the John F. Copper book that just came out this year, The KMT Returns to Power. I'm no expert on Taiwan. I've spent some time there and I've lived there, but I have not spent a lot of time studying it, so I have to turn to secondary sources, academic experts, to get some basic ideas here, but I've tried to lay them out for you in this slide. Among those advantages were the U.S. protection, starting at the time of the Korean War, plus the rather continuous U.S. pressure to tone down the authoritarian aspects of government and make free China, as it was called in the 50s and 60s, something that was really free China. Now, during all that time, the KMT, they were very authoritarian. As a matter of fact, their rule was similar in some ways to the rule that the UC described, as we just went through, on mainland China today by the CCP. They controlled all the levers of government. They were very heavily influential in the business world, but they allowed people more freedoms than exist today in China, but they're developing in China anyway. More freedoms in the area of religion, changing jobs, moving house, and so on. You could not emigrate overseas, however, without a lot of trouble in Taiwan in the 50s and 60s. That became more liberal in the 1970s. But in the 1980s, the military, specifically military intelligence headed by Wang Sheng, I showed you a slide of that Napoleonic sort of figure. He was about 5'4" tall. Wang Sheng led a group of people who were opposed to Zhang Jingguo's liberalization efforts, gradual though they were, in the early 1980s, and they assassinated, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, I think, they assassinated on U.S. soil a political opponent of the Kuomintang. They did it using Chinese gangsters. And this made the Americans rather upset. No country likes to have assassinations conducted on its soil, at least not without its permission. And indeed, that assassination in Daly City, just south of San Francisco, was done without U.S. permission. So this became a diplomatic problem between the U.S. and Taiwan, and for Zhang Jingguo, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, and he decided to move toward political liberalization, as I think I gave a little bit of an introduction to 2 weeks ago. So he promoted to the vice presidency this other man, Li Denghui, who I mentioned a moment ago, and Li Denghui rose to be the successor to Zhang Jingguo, and indeed he began a new era of open democracy that led to the victory of Chen Shui-bian eventually in 2000. Although, going on to slide 32, there were lots of problems with Chen Shui-bian's administration. Now, he encouraged a lot of people who wanted to see Taiwan move toward independence. And indeed, if conditions had been somewhat different, if, for example, the government on the mainland had been much weaker, if the Americans had been supportive because they thought they could get away with allowing Taiwan to become independent in name as well as in fact, then it might have worked out. But the Chinese communists were not weak. They were very strong. They remain very strong today. There is no hope of Taiwan independence. Most people in Taiwan realize that. About 5% of the Taiwan electorate, when polled, will say that they would like to have reunification with the mainland immediately under the communist government. About 10% will say they would prefer to have absolute independence. Screw those guys, we want to be by ourselves. But the 85% in the middle sort of roll their eyes at all this and say, you've got to be kidding. There's no way that that's practical. The government on the mainland would never allow it. It would mean war. It would mean invasion. It would mean devastation. We don't need that. We're not going to go for that. And that's one reason why Chen Shui-bian's administration eventually fell. And whether or not he was really guilty of corruption, I don't know. There's a lot of dispute over that. He was convicted on corruption charges in 2009, and I think he's serving. He's in jail now. I believe he's serving a 19-year sentence for corruption, which involved members of his family. Supposedly involved him. But one of the main problems with governance in Taiwan today, when democracy first took hold there, is very interesting. In studying American government, you may have seen pictures of, not photos, but drawn illustrations of members of Congress in the 1820s and 1830s assaulting each other, beating each other up on the floors of Congress, mostly over the slavery issue. These were the early days of American democracy. And indeed, in Taiwan, one of the big problems, is too bad I couldn't grab a photograph of this, was people breaking out on the floor of the legislature in Taiwan, breaking out in fistfights against each other, discussing all sorts of different issues, but the main ones were the nature of whether or not to pursue independence. But there were others that caused altercations, physical altercations between legislators that you would not have in the United States today. One is tempted to say, because we have such a mature democracy, but I'll leave that to people who know more about fisticuffs and legislation than I do. One of the big problems, though, that defined the DPP's administration was the inability to resolve deadlocks between the two parties. All this time between 2000 and 2008, the KMT and its ally retained control of the legislature. And so Chen Shui-bian's, as I mentioned a moment ago, sorry to repeat myself, Chen Shui-bian's legislative program never went anywhere. Going on to slide 33. So in 2008, after there had been a lot of trouble with the mainland and people were becoming rather frightened, to be honest, I was in Taiwan quite a bit during this whole period, and I made a point, because I am interested in these things, to talk to people about politics. And indeed, in Taiwan, one of the other differences between the mainland and Taiwan is you can openly speak about politics with anybody, and nobody's going to get upset about it. People basically lost confidence in the Democratic Progressive Party, figuring they really did not know, not only did they not know how to consolidate domestic political power, but they did not know how to deal with the mainland. And in 2008, the KMT reunited and managed to elect this very seasoned politician here, Ma Ying-jeou, that's Ma Ying-jeou, who had been mayor of Taipei. Now, Taiwan, under Ma Ying-jeou, has become, you might say, closer to the mainland, but even if you disagreed with that idea, they have become less confrontational with the PRC. The PRC no longer sees a threat of Taiwan declaring itself independent. And indeed, as current political circumstances continue, if they remain stable, then it's more than likely that there will be continued prosperity on both sides of the straits, economic catastrophe, unexpected catastrophe of the future notwithstanding, that there'll be stability, that the two sides will understand the limits of the other and will get along well enough so that commerce between the two can take place. And indeed, direct flights between the mainland and Taiwan, which were prohibited previously, have begun during this period. That was a big step. And investment between the two sides has picked up quite a great deal. Not only investment from Taiwan to the mainland, but now there is investment that is starting to occur from the mainland to Taiwan. A completely new situation. However, I have to say, and people don't like to talk about this, that if things deteriorated on the mainland, which they eventually will, if you look at Chinese history, China does not stay united forever. It has always become unstable during certain periods of history when the central government becomes weak and people become dissatisfied with it. There is a tendency for the provinces to want to strike out on their own, whether in name or in fact. And if in the uncertain future, not tomorrow, not next year, probably not 5 years from now, but if in the uncertain future things in the mainland become more uncertain and there is instability and there is a weaker and weaker rule from Beijing, then Taiwan becomes a real wild card, because if it stays stable with its democratic form of government, then it's entirely possible that people on the mainland will begin to look at Taiwan and wonder why the mainland is not ruled also by elections, why the mainland does not allow free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement, freedom of emigration. Emigration meaning moving away from the country, which only started in Taiwan in the mid and late 80s. Why can't we do the same things that they're doing on Taiwan? After all, look at them. If the situation went that way, look at them. They're stable, they're rich. There aren't as many problems. We'll talk more about these sorts of problems of contemporary Chinese communism next week. I wish you luck on your papers, and I'm looking forward to reading them.